It's your cousin's birthday next weekend. Mom's making her special lasagna, my sister announced casually over the phone, her voice light with anticipation. Everyone's going to be there. I gripped my phone tighter, trying to ignore the familiar tightness in my chest. Everyone except us, you mean? The silence that followed confirmed what I already knew. My children and I existed in the margins of family gatherings, mentioned in passing, but rarely included. Another invitation extended to my sister, another oversight for me. She didn't specifically say not to come, my sister finally offered, her voice tinged with discomfort. Maybe she just assumed you knew. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. We both knew better. This dance of exclusion and excuses had been choreographed years ago, its steps now automatic. Right, I said, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. Tell everyone we said hello. After hanging up, I wandered to the living room, where my children's artwork hung alongside our family photos. Ellie's watercolor landscapes and James's intricate pencil drawings, creations my mother had glanced at with polite disinterest during her rare visits. I stared at the family portrait from 3 years ago, everyone gathered around my parents on their 40th anniversary. My children stood awkwardly at the edge, as if the photographer couldn't quite fit them in the frame. How many times had I tried to build bridges between my children and their grandparents? How many Sunday dinners had I initiated, only to watch my mother flinch when James made too much noise or Ellie asked too many questions? The familiar ache of rejection spread through my chest, not for myself this time, but for my children, who deserved so much more. They're just more active than your sister's kids, my mother would say, her smile tight. It's harder to have them over with your father's migraines. Yet somehow my sister's children found their artwork displayed on the refrigerator, their school events marked on my parents' calendar. They received weekends at Grandma's house while mine received polite, distanced interest, the kind reserved for distant relatives rather than flesh and blood. For years, I had made excuses. Mom is just old school. Dad doesn't understand neurodivergent children. They'll come around if I just try harder. I planned family gatherings, coordinated visits, sent photos and updates, building a one-sided bridge that no one crossed. I'd become an expert at denial, at smoothing over the jagged edges of reality to protect myself from a truth too painful to acknowledge. My children were not wanted in the way my sister's children were. The realization felt like a betrayal, not just of me, but of everything I believed about family, about unconditional love, about the sacred bond between grandparents and grandchildren. The first signs appeared when Ellie was born. My pregnancy had been difficult, culminating in an emergency C-section that left me physically and emotionally depleted. My mother visited briefly, focused more on keeping my apartment clean than on bonding with her first grandchild. She's so fussy, she'd observe, holding Ellie at arm's length when she cried. Your sister's baby hardly ever cries. When James was born 3 years later, the pattern was already established. My sister's children were easy. Their milestones celebrated, their personalities praised. My children were challenging, their accomplishments acknowledged with reserved politeness, their struggles used as evidence of some unnamed deficiency. I'd spent years trying to crack the code, to understand what made my children less lovable in my parents' eyes. Was it because James had sensory processing issues that made him louder, more physical in his expressions of excitement? Was it because Ellie asked uncomfortable questions, refusing to accept the surface-level answers adults often give children? Or was it something in me, some failure in my parenting, some flaw in my character that had been passed down? The questions haunted me, driving me to try harder, to prove our worthiness through perfect behavior, thoughtful gifts, and constant attempts at connection. The breaking point came during last Thanksgiving. My parents had invited the entire extended family, except us. When I called to ask about it, my mother sounded genuinely surprised. "Oh, I thought you'd be busy with the kids' activities," she said. "And you know how James gets overwhelmed at big gatherings." The words sliced through years of denial. My mother hadn't forgotten to invite us. She had consciously excluded us. And worse, she had weaponized my son's sensory processing challenges as justification. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table after the children were asleep, tears flowing freely. The realization settled like sediment. I had spent my adult life seeking approval from people who had no intention of giving it. I had exposed my children to rejection again and again, hoping desperately for a different outcome. I thought about my childhood, about how I'd always felt slightly out of step with my family. My sister had been the compliant one, the easy one. I had been the questioner, the one who didn't quite fit the mold. The pattern was repeating itself, calcifying into the next generation, and I had been its willing facilitator. In that moment of painful clarity, something shifted inside me. The constant ache of seeking validation transformed into something stronger, a fierce protectiveness toward my children and, surprisingly, toward myself. The next morning, I made a decision. I would no longer orchestrate family gatherings. I would no longer prompt my parents to call their grandchildren. I would no longer position my children for rejection. It wasn't a dramatic decision announced with fanfare. It was quiet, internal, more absence than presence. I stopped calling with updates. I stopped suggesting visits. I stopped mentioning my parents to my children, allowing their relationship, or lack thereof, to exist in its natural state without my intervention. "You seem different," my therapist observed a few weeks later. "I've stopped trying," I admitted. Not in a giving up way, but in a letting go way. I've been trying to make my parents love my children the way they love my nieces and nephews, and it's not working. She nodded slowly. "And how does that feel?" I considered this. Like I've been swimming upstream for years, and I've finally turned to float with the current. It hurts, but there's also relief. The relief didn't last long. When Christmas approached, my mother called, her voice sharp with accusation. "So you're just not bringing the kids around anymore? You're punishing us because we can't handle their behavior the way you want?" I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar pull to apologize to smooth things over. Instead, I took a deep breath. "Mom, I'm not punishing anyone. I'm protecting my children from feeling unwanted. When you're ready to have a real relationship with them, not just with the idea of them, we'll be here." "You're tearing this family apart," she said, her voice breaking. "Your father is heartbroken." The old guilt surged, but this time I recognized it for what it was. A learned response to manipulation, not a signal of wrongdoing. "I love you both," I said quietly, "but I won't teach my children that they need to earn love through perfect behavior. That's not love. That's conditional approval." The silence that followed was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold. "I never thought you'd turn against us like this. I guess we know where we stand now." After she hung up, I sat motionless, waiting for the tsunami of guilt to overwhelm me. Instead, I felt a strange sense of calmness. The worst had happened. I had been cast as the villain in my family's narrative. And yet, I was still standing. The fear that had kept me tethered to toxic patterns had lost its power. The months that followed were a strange mixture of grief and liberation. I mourned the family I had always wanted but never had. I grieved for my children, who deserved unconditional grandparental love. But I also discovered parts of myself that had been buried under decades of people-pleasing. I started a journal, documenting the small shifts in my perspective. Today, I made a decision without wondering what Mom would think. Today, I didn't apologize when James had a meltdown at the grocery store. Today, I trusted my own judgment. My sister called occasionally, her allegiance clearly divided. "They miss you," she would say, though we both knew it wasn't true. They missed the version of me that accommodated, that accepted the uneven ground of family dynamics without question. "They're welcome to call the kids anytime," I would reply. "The door is open." But we both knew they wouldn't walk through it. That would require acknowledging the patterns of favoritism, of subtle exclusion, of using difficult as a code word for less worthy. One evening, as I helped Ellie with her science project, I noticed something I hadn't before. Without the constant pressure to prove our worthiness, my children seemed lighter, more at ease in their own skin. James's outbursts had decreased, and Ellie's anxious need for validation had diminished. "Do you miss seeing Grandma and Grandpa?" I asked tentatively, unsure if I was opening a wound. Ellie considered the question with the thoughtful expression I'd come to cherish. "Not really," she said finally. "They never seem to want to know the real me." Her insight, so clear and unencumbered by adult complexities, brought tears to my eyes. Children see truths we try to shield them from, absorbing the unspoken dynamics we pretend they don't notice. And you know what, Mom? She continued. I like the real me, even if they don't. In that moment, I realized my daughter had already learned the lesson it had taken me 4 decades to grasp, that self-acceptance can't be built on the shifting sands of others' approval. Spring arrived, bringing with it my daughter's 10th birthday. The morning of her party, a small package arrived from my parents, a gift card and a formal card signed Love Grandma and Grandpa. No phone call, no personal message. Ellie looked at the card, her expression unnervingly adult. They don't really know me, do they, Mom? The question caught me off guard. What makes you say that, sweetheart? She shrugged. They sent me a gift card for Justice, but I haven't shopped there in 2 years. I'm into art supplies now. She set the card down. It's okay. I know they try. In that moment, I saw my daughter with new clarity. She wasn't damaged by my parents' emotional distance. She had observed it, processed it, and moved beyond it with more wisdom than I had shown in 40 years. Some people don't know how to love well, I said carefully. It doesn't mean you're not lovable. It means they have limitations. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation, and bounded off to prepare for her party. I remained, staring at the generic gift card, feeling an unexpected sense of peace. My children were going to be okay, not because I had secured my parents' approval, but because I had stopped seeking it. That evening, as Ellie's friends sang happy birthday around a cake adorned with paintbrushes made of fondant, I watched her face glowing with genuine joy. The absence of my parents was a quiet ache, but no longer a wound that consumed me. In their place stood friends who truly saw my children, who celebrated their uniqueness rather than viewing it as a burden. You've created a beautiful family, my closest friend whispered to me, gesturing to the laughter-filled room. Not the one you were born into, but the one you've chosen. Her words settled into my heart, a truth I was finally ready to accept. Family isn't just defined by blood. It's created through genuine connection, mutual respect, and the willingness to see each other as we truly are. Summer brought an unexpected phone call from my father, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Your mother and I have been talking, he began. We miss seeing the kids. I waited, silent, refusing to fill the uncomfortable pause as I would have in the past. We've been unfair, he continued finally. Your sister pointed some things out to us about how we treat her kids differently from yours. My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. Yes, you do. Another long silence. We'd like another chance. Maybe we could start with a short visit. Just an hour or two. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of this moment. Part of me wanted to rush forward with forgiveness, to smooth over the rough edges of conflict as I'd always done. Another part, the new part that had grown stronger in the months of separation, urged caution. I'd like that, Dad, but I need you to understand something first. My children aren't difficult. They're different, and different isn't wrong. I need to know you're interested in who they actually are, not who you wish they were. I can't promise we'll get everything right, he said quietly, but we want to try. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There were no tearful apologies or profound admissions, just a small opening, a tiny crack in the wall of estrangement. After hanging up, I wondered if I was making a mistake, if I was setting my children up for another round of subtle rejection. But healing doesn't happen in isolation. It requires opportunity, risk, and the courage to try again with new boundaries firmly in place. The visit was awkward at first. My parents arrived with tentative smiles and carefully chosen gifts. Art supplies for Ellie, a fidget cube for James that showed they'd actually been listening when I described his sensory needs. James hung back, watching with wary eyes. His memory of past interactions was sharper than I'd realized, his protective instincts finely tuned. Ellie, ever the diplomat, showed her grandparents her latest paintings with cautious enthusiasm. My mother struggled visibly when James interrupted her repeatedly, but instead of the familiar disapproving glance, she paused and redirected him gently. My father asked Ellie about her artwork with genuine interest, not the performative attention I was accustomed to seeing. The tension in my shoulders began to ease as I observed them making real efforts, small but significant. They weren't perfect. My mother still compared the children obliquely to their cousins, and my father checked his watch surreptitiously when James described his complex Lego creation in excruciating detail. But they were trying, and for the first time, the effort seemed authentic rather than obligatory. As they were leaving, my mother hesitated at the door. "We've missed a lot, haven't we?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes," I answered honestly. "You have." She nodded, accepting this truth without defensiveness. "Can we try again next week?" I studied her face, searching for the familiar signs of obligation rather than desire. Instead, I saw something new, a genuine sadness for what had been lost, a humble recognition of responsibility. "We'd like that," I said simply. That night, I added a new entry to my journal. Today, I witnessed the beginning of change. Not dramatic transformation, but small shifts that suggest possibility. I remain cautious, but open. My therapist had taught me about radical acceptance, the practice of accepting reality as it is, not as I wish it to be. I had finally accepted that my parents might never love my children the way they loved my sister's children. But I had also accepted that relationships can evolve, that people can grow, and that boundaries create the safety necessary for that growth to occur. The following weeks brought more visits, each slightly less awkward than the last. My parents began to learn James's triggers and how to navigate them. They discovered Ellie's passion for fantasy novels and brought her books they thought she might enjoy. Small gestures, but meaningful in their specificity. During one visit, James had a full meltdown after dropping his ice cream. In the past, my mother would have shot me a look of disapproval, a silent judgment of my parenting. This time, she sat quietly, waiting for the storm to pass, then helped him clean up without comment. Later, when James had calmed down and rejoined the others, my mother said something I never expected to hear. "I think I understand him better now," she said softly. "He feels everything so intensely. It must be overwhelming." Her words weren't perfect, and they didn't erase years of dismissal. But they represented something precious, the beginning of seeing my child as a person with a unique internal landscape, not as a problem to be managed. Healing isn't linear. It's a winding path of progress and setbacks, of boundaries tested and reinforced. My relationship with my parents remains a work in progress, sometimes warming, sometimes cooling when old patterns emerge. There are still family gatherings where my sister's children receive more attention, still moments when I catch my father's expression of bewilderment when confronted with James's intensity. The difference now is that I no longer internalize these moments as evidence of our unworthiness. I see them as reminders of human imperfection, of the gap between intention and impact. Most importantly, I no longer place my children in positions where they feel they must earn love through performance. When my parents slip into old patterns, I address it directly or we leave early. My children observe this and learn that relationships should nourish, not diminish. In therapy, I've come to understand that my parents' behavior wasn't malicious, but unconscious. Patterns inherited from their own childhoods, biases they never examined. This understanding doesn't excuse their actions, but it allows me to approach them with compassion rather than bitterness. My mother grew up in a home where emotions were considered weaknesses, where children were expected to be seen and not heard. My father was raised by parents who valued academic achievement above all else. They parented as they had been parented, unconsciously favoring the grandchildren who fit their narrow definition of good. The most profound change has been within myself. In standing up for my children, I finally stood up for the child I once was, the one who also sensed the uneven ground of conditional love but lacked the words to name it. I've started to reconnect with parts of myself that were silenced in childhood, my creativity, my sensitivity, my intuition. I've joined a writing group, something I'd always wanted to do but never prioritized. I've made friends who appreciate my complexity rather than requiring me to present a palatable version of myself. My children watch me navigate these complex relationships, learning from my stumbles and successes. They see that love sometimes requires difficult conversations, that healing sometimes requires distance, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. "You're stronger now, Mom," Ellie observed recently with the piercing insight of children. "What makes you say that?" I asked. She considered this carefully. "You used to get really quiet and sad after we visited Grandma and Grandpa. Now you just seem peaceful." like you know who you are. Out of the mouths of babes comes wisdom we spend decades seeking in therapy. Last month, my parents invited us to a family reunion. The old anxiety surfaced immediately. Memories of previous gatherings where my children had been subtly marginalized, where I had spent the entire time hypervigilant, reading the room for signs of disapproval. "We don't have to go," I told the children at dinner. "It's completely up to you." James looked uncertain, but Ellie surprised me. "I think we should," she said. "Grandma and Grandpa are trying. And besides," she added with a smile that reflected my own growing confidence, "we don't need them to like us. We already know we're awesome." The day of the reunion arrived, clear and warm. As we pulled into my parents' driveway, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, the body remembering past wounds. But this time, I acknowledged it without being ruled by it. "Remember," I told my children, "we can leave anytime you want, and you don't have to hug anyone if you don't want to." Inside, the house was filled with relatives, some I hadn't seen in years. My sister's children were at the center of attention, as always, but something was different. My mother made a point of introducing Ellie to a cousin who shared her interest in art. My father had set up a quiet corner with books and headphones for James, anticipating his need for sensory breaks. These weren't grand gestures, but they were intentional ones. They represented a willingness to see my children as individuals with specific needs and preferences rather than inconveniences to be tolerated. The day wasn't perfect. There were still moments of comparison, still instances where I felt the old inequality. But I no longer measured success by the absence of pain. I measured it by my ability to navigate pain without losing myself in it. As we were leaving, my mother hugged me, a real embrace, not the perfunctory gesture I was accustomed to. "Thank you for giving us another chance," she whispered. "We're all learning," I replied. And it was true. We were all learning to love better, to see more clearly, to heal old wounds without creating new ones. The journey continues. Some days, reconciliation seems possible. Other days, the old patterns resurface, and I must reinforce boundaries. But I no longer see this as failure. Family healing isn't about reaching a perfect destination. It's about changing the way we travel together. I've learned that standing my ground isn't selfish, it's necessary. That setting boundaries isn't punishment, it's protection. That speaking truth isn't disrespectful, it's honest. And most importantly, I've learned that the uneven ground of family love can be navigated without losing your footing, if you're willing to walk away when necessary, and if you're brave enough to return on your own terms. In the quiet moments when my children are asleep and the house is still, I sometimes take out my journal and read through the entries of the past year. The path of healing unfolds on those pages, not a straight line from wounded to healed, but a spiral that sometimes circles back before moving forward. What strikes me most is how the entries have changed over time. The early ones are filled with pain, anger, and confusion. The later ones reflect a growing sense of peace, of acceptance, of compassion, not just for my children and myself, but for my parents too. We are all products of our histories, carrying forward patterns we often don't recognize until they've caused harm. Breaking these patterns requires courage, consciousness, and the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than reaching for the false comfort of denial. My relationship with my parents is still evolving, still finding its new shape, but the landscape of my inner world has transformed irrevocably. I no longer measure my worth by their approval. I no longer absorb their judgment as truth. I no longer ignore my intuition when it signals danger. This is what healing looks like, not the absence of pain, but the presence of wholeness. Not the perfection of relationships, but the authenticity of connection. Not the erasure of the past, but the creation of a future guided by conscious choice rather than unconscious pattern. The uneven ground of family love taught me to find my balance, not by conforming to its contours, but by standing firmly in my truth and teaching my children to do the same. In this way, pain becomes wisdom, boundaries become freedom, and the legacy of conditional love ends with our generation.